Hey everybody, and welcome back to another episode of Cryptique, a special, short, sort of impromptu episode where I'm joined, Brian by the way, joined by my podcast partner in crime, Jay. And I don't have any good jokes. I used to have a file of them, like the only man I know who, we're kind of moving away from that, evolving a little bit. But I wanted to do this quick episode because I, as you know, Jay, have been looking at cars lately. Kim's car is kind of kaput. And we've been looking at what's out there, and the climate that we're in right now in terms of the car market is really strange. We're in a place where like a 5-year-old crossover, like a family vehicle, like either of us would need, is $30,000, $33,000 in some cases. I've seen used
90,000 miles on them.
Yeah, with not insignificant numbers of miles. Yeah. So we were going to different dealerships and we wound up looking at a Ford Mach-E, Mustang Mach-E. I hate using that Mustang branding because I think that's silly. The Mach-E should have been its own thing. Mm-hmm. But we really liked it, and they were doing a special where the financing was 0%, which over the term of the loan would make it about as expensive as financing like a $33,000 used vehicle, because interest rates are ridiculous right now. And I've just been doing a lot more research on EVs because I don't want Steve Gorham to come back and yell at me for buying an EV at the wrong time. But earlier today, while I was working, I was listening to TED Talks. And I haven't done that in a while. And I wound up finding a TED Talk that I really thought that I should talk to you about. And this guy is essentially discussing, how would you put it? The kind of the place that EVs currently have, like in the world or in, our battle against climate change and pollution and things like that. This particular TED Talk is by a guy named Graham Conway, and it's a couple years old. It was from a TEDx done in San Antonio. And he's just talking about the technology that we have and kind of the problems that we have, in particular with CO2 and the way we get energy and derive energy from the resources we have. So I'll start playing it and I'll just pause it. And it's pretty heavily edited. I'll have links to this, and there might be one more clip that I'll show. Those will be in the show notes along with all of our usual stuff. Let me go ahead and pull this up.
Let her rip.
Climate change is a hoax, and the electric vehicle is an abomination.
Now there he's saying an abomination. I don't know why the audio ducks there, but I just want to be clear. He says the electric vehicle is an abomination.
Someone once told me that to capture an audience's attention, you need to offend them. And what better way to offend people than to denounce climate change? Because if there's one thing the world may unanimously agree upon, is that we'd all like it to be here in the future. But I do have a problem.
And I want to point out here the jitteriness in the video is because of my editing. This guy in his original talk has a lot of long pauses, which are presumably for audience reactions. But you can't really hear them through his microphone. They don't do us any good here.
With the way we define electric vehicles, I absolutely believe they are the future of personal transportation. They do a fantastic job at moving pollution out of densely populated cities. They're fun to drive, and you can get free parking too sometimes. There will absolutely be a place for the electric vehicle in our future, but not today. Let me start with a question. There are 1 billion passenger cars on the world's roads today. If I gave you a button which would turn them all into electric vehicles, would you push it? The problem of climate change is a global one. It is believed to be caused by increasing CO2 concentrations in our atmosphere.
Now, we've had Steve Gorham on before, and he's talked about this before, that CO2 itself is not so much of a problem. I think we all agree that climate change is happening. Steve agrees that climate change is happening. His argument, to me, seems to be that going after cars so aggressively is not the solution. And it's maybe not even the biggest problem that we have.
Sure.
So I just want to get that out.
If you put a box around the Earth and measured the gases trapped inside that box, you would indeed find CO2. And that CO2 levels are rising. What is causing CO2 levels to rise? Well, one source is the cars and trucks that we drive. These emit CO2 from the tailpipe. And the way the industry currently measures this CO2 is like putting a special box around the vehicle and measuring what's inside the box. Society's solution to the problem is the electric vehicle. Because if you put a box around the electric vehicle and try and measure CO2, you won't find any.
And this goes along with what Steve's told us before, right? That a lot of people take an overly simplistic view and think of electricity as like, well, electricity is green. And my PC here is not spewing any black smoke. I don't smell any diesel fuel or anything like that, so it feels pretty green. But depending on where you are, not necessarily so.
They believe that we can achieve net zero. They literally believe that if they buy an electric car, it has zero imprint on the environment.
This way of measuring CO2, we've decided to call these zero emissions, or we call these dirty. But let me show you why this is wrong. Consider that instead of changing all vehicles into electric vehicles, we instead change them into horses. Now, a horse breathes in air and it breathes out CO2. So if you put a box around the horse, you would measure CO2. If you rode that horse the same distance as you drove the car, the horse emits as much CO2 as a Corvette. So you can see, based on this way of measuring CO2, our only possible conclusion is that if we changed all cars into horses, we would be emitting as much CO2 as 1 billion Corvettes.
Now, I have not gone into his methods. I don't know how he's researching this, although it doesn't really matter for the message of his talk.
Okay.
You know, he's not saying that CO2 is the ultimate bad thing. He goes on well past what I have here to talk about other more immediate solutions to not just rising CO2 levels, but pollution in general created by, you know, mining, whether that's mining for battery materials, mining for coal.
As you sit there, I'm sure something deep inside of you is saying, that doesn't sound right. And you'd be correct. Of course, if we changed all cars into horses, our climate would be better. And here's why it would be better. You see, even though the horse breathes out CO2 into the atmosphere, that CO2 is then absorbed by plants and converted back into oxygen, which the horse breathes in again. And so you see the CO2 is in a cycle. And because it is in a cycle, it doesn't increase. In contrast, the car is different. Because with the car, we dig oil out of the ground, we burn it, and we produce CO2. And it isn't in a cycle, so it is increasing.
And there's probably a lot of people out there who can refute this. And not just refute this simplicity of it, but to say like the CO2 produced by a horse is probably greater than what you could get by, you know, sort of that CO2 being reclaimed by plant life, where you need X number of units of land dedicated to plants that are most efficient at doing this. But, you know, that's not exactly the focus of this. So I'm kind of preempting a lot of comments that we're probably going to get, or people who are going to be like, well, this is junk science, I'm just going to tune out.
Sure. You were right to be skeptical, but based on how we currently measure CO2, you could not possibly have come to this conclusion without doing this type of analysis. Let's go back to the electric vehicle. Remember, the way we quantify CO2 is to measure it from the tailpipe, but the electric car doesn't burn fuel, but it does use electricity. A large proportion of our electricity comes from coal. Now, we dig coal out of the ground in large quantities. We then burn it in power stations, which produces CO2. You can see there is no arrow along the top of this diagram. That CO2 is not in a cycle, and it is increasing. But you couldn't possibly know this by only measuring the vehicle's tailpipe. What we need to do is expand our imaginary box to include everything. So let's have a look at things on a global scale. How much of the world's electricity is produced by burning fuel, which creates CO2? It's about 2/3. So you can see when you plug your electric vehicle in, you are probably producing CO2. It just isn't being measured. You see, the automotive industry has cleverly found a way to move the problem, not solve the problem. But is the electric vehicle really worse? Well, to understand if it's worse, we need to look at how much emissions are produced during the life of the vehicle. The average age of a vehicle before it gets scrapped is around 180,000 miles.
Now, does that number surprise you?
Sounds high. I've never driven 180,000 miles.
Yeah.
I've never driven a car that's got 180,000 miles on it.
I have a car right now that I inherited, but it has 166,000 miles on it. And it actually still runs great. We use it kind of primarily to haul the dogs around.
Yeah, I mean, I had an old Civic that when I sold it, I think had 137 on it. And then I had a Toyota pickup that had like 120 on it that probably would have gotten me 300,000 if I didn't drive them into the ground like I did. But
Yeah.
I mean, damn, 180,000. I don't think there's a lot of cars out there, on the road that have that. They might be able to be drugged behind a trailer or on a trailer, but man, no, that seems way high for me. But
well, and that's another thing with the car market that I've noticed is that cars going up for sale, like the kind of cars that a dealership seems to be willing to take and actually sell on the lot, is changing. The mileage that they're willing to accept and try to still market that car as having a useful life is way higher. Kim's youngest sister just bought like an Equinox or something, like not a great like prestigious car, but it has about 100,000 miles on it, and I think she paid like 10 grand for it.
you know why? Because those cars are just Chevy Cruzes that have bigger tires and a little bit more headroom. They're garbage. I mean, like the new Blazers or Trailblazers or whatever they call them. The standard motor is a 1.4 liter turbo.
Yeah.
It's not enough. It's just not. I'm
Yeah,
sorry. I'm ruining your whole TED Talk.
No, it's fine. There was actually Top Gear did a thing on that years ago. Like they did this little sort of test. They had these different cars that had different sized engines. Some of them were these really small, like 1.4, or even I think down to 1.2 on maybe like a Fiat Panda or something. And they were trying to figure out which ones were more efficient. Is it the really small one with a supercharger or turbocharger that they squeeze more power out of? And I think the conclusion was, at least in their driving, was it was more efficient to drive a heavier vehicle with a bigger engine. It's just the bigger engine is producing, or it's not working as hard.
There's less RPMs.
Producing as much emissions. It's not running through as much fuel. It's easier for it. So even though it's a bigger engine that in theory uses more fuel, it's a lot easier for it. And it led me to one of my probably best personal realizations. My grandma had an 87, I think, Plymouth Horizon, and I actually really liked that car. But I couldn't put my finger on why. And James May, who was on that show, talked about really liking, I think, the Fiat Panda, because he says a car is always the most fun when it's at the limits of what it can do. And a Fiat Panda is always at its limit. Like going around a roundabout or like grocery store runs, it's at its limits.
How about the Ford Fiesta or Festiva? They have an ST model that has like 230 horsepower, and it's supposed to be one of the most fun cars on the road to drive.
Yeah.
The Fiesta.
I would actually really like a Fiat 500 Abarth if I could find one.
Like you like the shittiest.
The Abarth, the like mini pint-sized Lamborghini. It'd be fun, but I would look like a circus bear driving something that small. Anyway.
You can see the conventional vehicle produces about 30 tons of CO2 over its lifetime. How does the electric vehicle look? Pretty good, right? Because some of that electricity comes from renewable sources, and because the electric motor is far more efficient than the internal combustion engine, it produces less CO2. There is a problem with this graph. This graph says that at 0 miles, 0 CO2 has been produced. And if you think about that for a second, it means that the two cars have magically appeared in the showroom out of thin air. In reality, a huge amount of CO2 is produced just making a vehicle, because you have to dig raw materials out of the ground, transport them to factories where they can be formed into car parts before finally being assembled into vehicles. Each step requires energy, and so we create CO2. So you can see the conventional vehicle comes to the showroom having generated about 6 tons of CO2. And now this is the critical part. Making a battery isn't easy. The materials required are harder to find, and making a battery cell requires a huge amount of energy. So the battery vehicle comes to the showroom having generated about 12 tons of CO2. And you can see you'd have to drive it around 80 or 90,000 miles before you offset that CO2 penalty.
Yeah, and this is not, again, something that you can just say it's 80,000 miles every time or 90,000 miles every time. You'd have to have specific data on how things are produced. One of the things that turned Kim off of the Mach-E that we were looking at is there's no tax credit. and we didn't know why. So we did some research on it, and it looks like there's something with the way it's produced that causes it to not have a tax credit. We had looked at Teslas, and as far as we can tell, the Teslas are built in the U.S. and the batteries are built in the U.S. Tesla has that giant battery factory in Nevada. The Ford is built in Mexico, and components of the battery, whatever that means, I don't know if that's the cells, but the documentation I found said that because components of the batteries are made in China, it doesn't qualify.
So it doesn't matter. It's because they're made in China?
Yeah, so I don't know if the requirement is that certain parts of the car have to be manufactured in the U.S., or maybe it's just that this is not a very American car, because a lot of the last really 8 years through both administrations has been largely concerned about moving production of certain things back to the U.S. for different reasons, either purely economic or because we're realizing how vulnerable our supply chains are to shortages that are difficult to control internationally.
Or we need 100 million new jobs for the illegal immigrants.
Or whatever, yeah. All right. But yeah, that was one of the things that we had looked at. And then, I mean, there's a little component of it there that's like, well, how much worse for the environment is it to produce the batteries in China and ship them here, or ship them to Mexico, build the car, and then send the car here, as opposed to doing it all within the country?
It is better in the end.
Oh, go on.
I'm sorry. Just look in your grocery store. It was some kind of oranges, maybe canned oranges, picked in South America, shipped to Thailand, canned in Thailand, and then shipped to America. What the fuck is going on, people?
So the electric vehicle still looks good here as well, right? Well, this is where it gets interesting. You see, the conventional vehicle has a 400-mile range, while the electric vehicle in this example has a 125-mile range. Now, 125 miles might be enough for some of you, but most of us want more. We'd like to be able to drive great distances across the states. Or if you're here in Texas, you might just want to get to the next city. So really, we need to be comparing a 400-mile range electric vehicle. And as you may have guessed, a longer range requires a larger battery, which means a larger CO2 penalty. And now you start to see the problem. Over its expected lifetime, it has emitted more CO2 than the conventional vehicle. It has contributed more to climate change than the conventional vehicle, and that is the crux of the problem. It has produced more CO2, but we've measured none.
Yeah. So that really stuck out to me. This idea of how environmentally friendly your vehicle is, and whether or not it's really practical to use EVs and expect them to kind of save the environment or stop pollution or make the air quality better. Like he's saying, probably in your immediate area, sure. But globally, you're kind of just pushing the pollution from the car to the point where the power is made. Now, in certain places, like in Illinois and really the St. Louis area, there's nuclear power, there's renewables around here. I don't know how much is fossil fuels or coal or whatever else in this area, but I know our power, at least compared to the rest of the country, is relatively cheap. But it's still, I don't know. It's kind of one of those things of you would almost have to move somewhere that had cleaner power if you really wanted to make that kind of a difference. And Tesla, from what I understand from reading Elon Musk's biography, he got into it not because he thought it was going to save the environment. He was like, we need another option than oil. Like, we keep getting into these conflicts over oil. We need to do something else. GM tried to do it and it didn't work out. And then they listened to the market research. And the people were saying, I need to fit 5 people. I need to be able to go 400 miles. I need to be able to fuel up in 3 minutes. I need all these things that we talked about with Steve that are really important for like long range truckers. But the average person really doesn't drive that far.
Right.
So
well, that makes sense with Elon, though. Like, I'm just trying to make something that's cool for people. I'm not saying this is the answer to save the planet. But if he's just saying these are some cool cars, check them out, drive them, have some fun.
Anyway, this guy in his talk goes on, further than I wanted to continue, because he's largely talking about that right now hybrids are probably the way to go. Everybody knows what a hybrid is, but there are 2 kinds. There's the plug-in electric hybrids where they can run exclusively on electricity for a little while. The Chevy Volt was an example of that. And then there's like the Prius, or what the Prius used to be, where the electric motor assists the car in getting up to speed. You know, a gas engine is least efficient when speeding up and most efficient when it's maintaining a speed like on the highway. So it takes the advantages of both. You know, an electric car, better at speeding up, less efficient at maintaining a speed. And
The new Prius,
go on.
I was just going to say the new Priuses are good looking cars too. I mean, they're not the duck head looking thing they used to be. They're actually stylish now.
Toyota used to, it seems, to go to great lengths to make their cars as ugly as they could possibly be.
Yes.
I remember for a long time, it's like, it must take a lot of work to make a car this repulsive, like to make a RAV4 look this bad. And then they just put like a more simple front on them, and it's like that I would drive.
Yeah.
Anyway, I do have another clip that I wanted to show you that I thought just went along with this well, because again, I'm looking at this from the perspective of, should I buy one of these? Should I trust this as my family vehicle?
Let us know at cryptiquepodcast@gmail.com. Tell us what kind of car Ryan should buy.
No, they're going to be like, you should buy a Lada, or what else, like a Geo Metro, something like that.
Conflicted about electric cars. I've had 6 now. 2 of them were hydrogen fuel cell Toyotas before the whole hydrogen infrastructure thing fell apart.
Yeah.
Now, this is James May, for those who don't know him, because Top Gear wasn't huge in the US, but it was in most of the rest of the world. And now he's doing shows on Amazon, like travel shows, kind of like, I think the most recent one, he's going to India, but he's done Italy and Japan before that.
Give me his email address.
But they're essentially electric cars, driven by an electric motor. But with BEVs, there's a lot I like about them. I like the silence. I mean, it feels like magic and Star Trek to me, because I'm of a certain age. I like that they're polite. I can leave my little country hobbit cottage at 4 a.m. without disturbing even a worm.
Yeah.
It's fantastic. But I still think the ambition is way ahead of the battery technology. It's still not really good enough.
And that is something that Steve was talking about as well, because the batteries are so hard to produce. They're so heavy. You know, one of the things that we noticed with the Teslas that we were driving was it feels more or less like a normal car once you're going. The interior noise is a little loud. I think that's just got to do with the way the car is constructed, because the other ones didn't have that. But you can feel this massive weight under you, which is why, in my opinion, like a small little commuter car should probably have a range of like 100 miles, because you can have a much smaller battery that's a lot less heavy. You're going to have a lot less wear on your tires and things like that. They're going to be easier to produce. You could produce probably 3 of them, 2 to 3 of them for every one of like these huge long range batteries that they're starting to put on like the electric Silverados and things, where they're trying to make these able to haul a bunch of weight.
Let's make this thing weigh 50,000 pounds.
Well, the new Hummer, doesn't the new Hummer EV weigh like 9,000 pounds?
I have no idea. If you're driving a fucking electric Hummer, you are just so confused. I see people driving these H2s and they put all this gear on them like they're going 4-wheeling and stuff. It's like, dude, that's a Suburban. You're not doing any good 4-wheeling in that thing. You might be able to get through the snow just fine, maybe some dirt, good gravel road, and maybe a grass field, but you're not doing the shit that, you know, these
that the
like
H1s were doing. It's not a military vehicle anymore.
the Humvee. I'd love to have a Humvee. It's only a V6, man. Good
Yeah,
on gas.
yeah, it's
Good on diesel.
Right.
I argue with this with people of both sides, because you get the anti-EV people who are simply anti-EV because they're defensive about something. And then you get the ridiculous EV evangelists who say, oh, you know, I'm quite happy to stop driving after 250 miles an hour. And by the time I've had a Waz and eaten my burger, my car's charged. And I think, rubbish. What you're claiming is that the exhaustion of your range, your hunger, and an available charger coincide.
All coincide precisely.
Yeah. And they don't. You actually, if you drive all around the country, you end up navigating between high-speed chargers and hoping there aren't too many people on them.
Yeah, so all problems that we've talked about, that it's I think there are people who are overly optimistic about EVs and the impact that they'll have, just the place that they should have. Because what I've found is that I think most people like simple solutions. Completely get rid of this, do this other thing instead.
Mm-hmm.
So I think for probably 85% of people, going to something like a Fiat 500e which was their small like city commuter electric car that could do like 149 miles, I think it was estimated for. And you can still get them used for about 10 grand is what I've been seeing. That would probably do for most people.
But you have
One
to drive a
person
lady's car.
just going to and from work. Yeah, but it's great because when you get to work, you can just pick it up and take it in with you and nobody can steal it. But yeah, a lot of the research I was doing was, how reliable are these? What are people seeing? And the problem is just that they're so new, nobody really knows.
Mm-hmm.
Like the Mach-E's been out for, I think, 3 years, and the warranties are 8 years. So nobody has had an out-of-warranty battery problem yet, unless they've done something to it themselves, or like on purpose. But the way they degrade is slow and predictable, typically. Like these instances where people get in their car and it's just, all of a sudden I have 30 miles of range and my car's in this kind of like emergency mode. Those are pretty rare. So are battery fires. The Bolts had them for a little while, but Chevy recalled tens of thousands, I think, and replaced the batteries on them. And in a lot of cases, people wound up with a better battery than they had when they first bought the car. There are a lot of fears that are, I think, maybe kind of unfounded. The one that I've been curious about is why don't they rust? What happens when the undercarriage of your car starts rusting? And I don't know what they do with cars now, because I notice cars after like 2010 don't seem to have much rust under them, at least the ones that I deal with, because I do a lot of mechanical work for a lot of my friends. But I noticed in newer cars, they're very often not rusty. Like there will be bolts and things like that, or your exhaust system. But for the most part, they're pretty resistant to it. But it's still like, at what point is the car just old enough that you need to be worried about the battery shorting out because now there are gaps in the casing around it?
Yeah.
But anyway, I just thought this was an interesting topic because I think it does a good job of briefly highlighting some of the points that Steve talked about. Not to say that electric cars are bad, but to say that they need to take their natural course. And the first guy, Graham Conway, was talking about as technology advances, it's going to get easier and easier to produce these batteries. And it's going to take, it's going to have a much lower impact on the environment to produce them. And even Philips have released some videos that I've seen, or done some interviews at least, where they've talked about, specifically with Teslas, when your Tesla is done, like sent to the scrap, that battery ends up getting sent back to this plant, and 95% of the materials in it are recycled. So it's not necessarily all brand new material being mined. It's going to be at least partially recycled. In the future, it's going to be more and more from recycled. And so that CO2 penalty that he talked about is going to come down. But
I don't know, though, because, do you want to, how much is a new base Tesla? 50?
No.
You can just ballpark it, but do you want recycled shit in your car? Hey, here's a brand new car, except for it's all recycled.
Well, no, it's just the materials. It's the metals that are recycled.
I know, I understand that, but I don't know, man. I just don't buy any of the bullshit because we've been lied to about it so much. Like if someone lies to me a bunch of times and then they come and tell me something and say, but I'm not lying this time, I'm going to be like, bullshit. And you know what I mean? Like you can only lie to somebody so many times before they stop believing anything you say. And they're telling us we're going to be net zero by 2030. Come on, man. Net zero means that you built your car out of wood and stole some solar panels and put it on the trunk, and that's powering your car. Mm-hmm. It's not, you can't get to net zero, period. What are you using, kids to mine your stuff? You're not using bulldozers and caterpillars and stuff. It's never going to get to net zero. And that's the problem, is that they're telling us this bullshit. If they said, guys, listen, we think this is the future. We think by 2075, we can have all electric vehicles that are all safe. They all have a long range. They don't use as much electricity as they, once did or whatever. That would be palatable. But when someone says you're going to drive an electric vehicle by 2030, period, we don't like that in America. You know what I mean?
People are resistant to anything that's mandated.
Yeah, we rebelled over a 1% tea tax, right? Fuck you guys. We're not paying an extra percent for your tea. Well, I think this illustrates a good point. This was a good episode. I don't want to get too deep into it because we're already 40 minutes in and we kind of wanted to have a short one. But I mean, I agree with what the people are saying. And I think that those are the kind of people that need to be kind of, on the front lines for them. And those are the people where you need to be like, okay, you had a great idea. How do we make that happen? What can we do? Not just continue to lie.
Well, I don't know how much of it's lies. I think a lot of it's just politicized because it's more politically popular to say I have the solution than to say like, well, what we need to do is kind of mix this in. The mandates that I've seen are not saying that you have to have all electric by a certain date, but I think it's like 70% of cars are supposed to be electric by 2030 or 2035, if I'm remembering right. I could be wrong. They might say all of them need to be.
Or you're going to be paying, oh, well, you don't have an electric vehicle? That's fine. It's $10,000 a year taxes to have a gas vehicle.
Yeah, there might be some kind of other penalty like that. I mean, there's already sort of penalties in Illinois, I know. Certain fees are higher with an electric vehicle than with a gas one because you're not paying the tax on the gas, which goes to road maintenance and things like that. So they're trying to find ways to balance that out. But
the road maintenance needs to be paid by the electric vehicles because they're the ones like, we talked about where they're so
weigh like
heavy,
twice what a normal one does.
They're destroying the roads that were meant to not have every vehicle weigh 10,000 pounds.
Yeah.
And not only that, but totally had something to say, but I lost. It's gone. Sorry.
That's okay. Yeah, I think
I remember. It's because their tires, they fucking they fall apart faster, and that those microplastics from those tires are ending up in the water table, and that's what's in the ocean. Because standard rubber, like you're looking at a completely different tire for an 18-wheeler and a pickup truck. Totally different. And if you're making all like it has to be something where it's not just air pollution. What's the environmental impact of this car? Here's the stats. What's the environmental impact of this car? Here's the stats. And that's something that someone that's smarter than me is going to have to do. But I think that's an important thing that somebody should take up. I think Steve Gorham should take that up. That'd be great. For him to lead that charge.
Yeah, maintain a database that's like, how green is this? And it's like, well, this car gets these parts from potentially these 3 locations, and here's the average impact of those parts or whatever, or this transportation or this component. That would be really difficult. But yeah, I think there's a lot more room for different kinds of vehicles than we think. I mean, I think, I don't know the batteries are the way to go. Hydrogen might be the way to go. It's all just methods of storing energy. You're basically taking solar power, wind power, coal, whatever it is that you're using to generate it, and you're either storing it as a charge in a chemical battery, or through electrolysis, you're essentially converting that electricity into hydrogen to like store that energy, because now that potential energy is sort of in that hydrogen. So you can think of that like a battery as well. And maybe that's a good solution for a backup power source for your house. The excess power from your solar panels creates hydrogen, and then if your power goes out, a hydrogen generator kicks on. And maybe in cars, if you're driving one of these big heavy vehicles or something that's for off-roading, you use gas because you want the lighter weight and you want the flexibility of being able to fuel up more often. For a local commuter, because one of the points that I saw on Reddit, they're talking about the reliability. Most cars have some kind of major maintenance after 100,000 miles. Like transmission can go out, engine can go out, kind of similar to the battery going out. The battery is like the main thing that's going to kill an electric car, but it's pretty much the only thing to really go wrong other than door handles, windows, stuff like that, things that happen to every vehicle. And with a gas car, it's just, what day am I going to walk out, start it up, and it's not going to start, or the transmission's not going to go into gear, or whatever it is. So there are a significant number of people, it seems like, who are realizing, hey, a 5-year-old Bolt is cheap and the battery hasn't degraded very much, and I know how it's going to degrade over time, and it's going to be fine for my 15-mile commute to work for a long time. And I'm not going to have a transmission go out. I'm not going to have this day where it just doesn't start. So I think those are really useful for those circumstances. But there's a place for all different kinds of technologies. Trucks, really, it should be rail for the most part, as opposed to these long-range trucks. I don't really know why we
Yeah.
got away from that, other than it was probably some kind of collusion by auto manufacturers. I know that's why the trolleys are gone.
Yeah.
But it should be trains to most cities and then trucks for local deliveries, which would be fine to be electric. We have those
Right.
Rivian Amazon trucks running around all over the place here, and those seem to be doing fine.
Well, I don't know. They need to go back to railroad for sure. And then you can get into like the Japanese trains. You can go 300 miles an hour. Now you're not going to do that with a freight train, but you can go
Yeah.
faster. My problem with the EVs, one of my problems, is the target. So you have wealthy white collar people that want to tell us what we have to drive. Well, Bill down the street, he's got a lawn care service that he worked his ass off and saved up all this money to buy this big truck and all these lawnmowers. He's the target. That guy's the one that's fucking the environment up. That's not the guy that's fucking the environment up. The one that's fucking the environment up, and I'll stop saying the F word, is the soccer mom that has one kid that needs a suburban sized Cadillac Escalade that gets 14 miles a gallon. That is who you need to target, because there's so many people that have to have big full size trucks for work. And these are not white collar people that are making $300,000 a year. These are people that work their ass off every day to put food on the table. And those people are the targets. It's like, it's not Bill down the street, dude. You're pointing at this guy because he's got a diesel pickup, which he absolutely has to have for work.
Yeah.
But you're not saying anything about the rich lady that lives down the street that has to have $140,000 Cadillac Escalade suburban length for one kid.
Yeah. Wasn't it like Zootopia, I think, where Bruce Willis voiced one of the animals, and they're looking at this huge Suburban. They're like, wow, how many humans fit in that? And he's like, usually just one.
Yeah. All right. Well, I guess we can wrap this one up. I mean, it's in the future, but it's further away than what you're being told.
Yeah, it's, the battery thing, I'm kind of thinking of like aluminum. Most of our aluminum is recycled. Like a lot, your can is probably made from recycled aluminum. And if you're in the US, almost certainly whatever books you've bought in the last decade or two are made of recycled paper. There's very little impact. There's much more impact on the environment to build a Kindle and have that Kindle shipped to you than it is to just go to your local bookstore and buy the physical book. And it's eventually going to be similar with cars. They're going to get so good at making them, they will naturally progress. I mean, I think if lithium sulfur batteries, those have been being tested for decades. And if they could figure out this reaction problem that causes these dendrites to form, and I don't want to get into it too much. I was reading about these. There's a certain reaction that happens that basically ruins the batteries really quickly, and they're trying to find ways to isolate some of these components so it doesn't happen. But when they are working correctly, they have about 5 times the energy density of a normal lithium-ion battery. So you're looking at a long-range Tesla getting like 1,200 miles of range for the same size battery, basically. And if that came out, people would be all about that. They'd be like, oh, I have to charge my car once every 2 months. This is fantastic. That's the kind of progression that we would naturally want to see. Yeah. And then if there are enough batteries in the system where they're constantly breaking them down, okay, we can pull all the the cobalt, manganese, and all the stuff that we need out of this recycled gunk that we don't have to mine anymore. It would naturally progress that way. But yeah, I think the most environmentally friendly thing you could probably do is buy a used combustion engine car.
Are there people out there? I mean, there's got to be. I imagine that the copywriting and patents and stuff would be difficult, or the patent would be bought immediately for hey, I'll give you $10 million right now, cash, and then just shut it down. But now I say Tony Stark, but a battery or a power source that is tiny and super powerful is what's going to change. And I don't think it's going to be half the weight or twice the distance. I think it's going to have to be something that is an absolute game changer that we just haven't seen yet.
Yeah, it'd be something like a lithium sulfur battery, something where the weight is much less for the same range, because I think that's the biggest deal. And also just the way the batteries degrade. You know, some of these car manufacturers are going from nickel, cobalt, manganese chemistry to lithium iron phosphate, which is a little bit more efficient. You get a little bit more power out of the same space and weight. But the bigger deal is that they degrade 2 to 4 times slower than the previous chemistry, and they're more resistant to heat, so they're less likely to suffer from these sort of runaway reactions. But it's hearing all that noise.
Yeah. It sounds like you may have a demon upstairs with cloven hooves.
I have a
walking
Kim
around.
standing in front of the oven is what that sound is. There's like a spot in the floor that has moved since we had new flooring put down, and now one of these vents pops. But yeah, there's natural progression that's happening that will eventually get us there. And I don't think it's a conspiracy. I don't think it's necessarily a lie that EVs are going to like change things, but I think it is I don't think it's intentional. I don't think it's malicious, at least in and of itself. I think it's a politicized message. You know, I think most people could get by with it. I mean, there's places for every technology. I was looking for a spot to put a lamp because I needed a little bit more light where I was going to be working for like an hour. And I was looking around and I realized I had these old candlesticks that are like mostly decorative. I was like, screw it. I have emergency candles, stuck one in there. It's like, look at that. There's a place in my life for a candle as a light source for at least like an hour.
Yeah.
You know, so there's definitely a place for the combustion engine going forward, along with all these other things.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think that should probably be it for this one.
Yep, that's all I got.
So if you guys want to tell us what other impromptu topic you want us to cover, you can do that by emailing us at cryptiquepodcast@gmail.com. Find out what we're hawking over at. I'm just noticing like all of our podcast stuff is at cryptiquepodcaststore.com. You can help us keep the service on at buymeacoffee.com/cryptiquepi. You can check out all of our socials. They're behind Jay, or they're going to be in the show notes. And interact with the podcast however you can. If you watch this on YouTube, if you listen to it, it all helps us out. Appreciate it.
And if we got something wrong or you think we're, full of crap, let us know. Well, I mean, we're not afraid to take some criticism and, deal with it. It's natural, and, we're not 100% all the time either. So let us know if we got something wrong, and we'll go back and, do some more research. Go back to the drawing board.
Yep, your criticisms will likely be featured.
Yep. All right. Well, I guess that's all I got.
Yep.
All right. Good evening, Crypt Keepers. Super scary episode, right?
Totally.